I heard first. Check the video.
Was there anybody else there?
No, actually.
All right, so welcome everybody. Peter, one thing I recognize is the Zoom meeting being recorded out there. So voice prepares so you can capture hopefully. That's our fingers.
Elocution lessons are coming in handy.
We are in a different location this evening. We're typically at the public library and patent-free library. Tonight we are here at City Hall, which is a good venue. I'll have some tech here that can accommodate this. I'm just going to really turn it over to Peter, but as far as just logistics go, restrooms are on the second floor. We will typically look to end these at around 7 p.m. So we have an hour and a half of discussion time tonight. And with that, we'll just let Peter go.
Great, thank you, Doug. Thanks everybody for being here, taking time out.
Okay. There's just a brief plug. I know that we're not like a huge crowd, but I've been to several of these conversations and really always not time afterwards to talk to the folks that are here. So if you are interested, if you guys are going to go down to Maxwell's after and just like grab a drink and keep chatting and welcome to the room.
Am I invited or would you?
Yes, please.
Thanks for having me and for carving some time out of your busy weeks to do this pre-storm. I'm going to do we'll go through some material pretty quickly, and I'm going to jump back on the computer for one section of this, but many of you have seen this before when I made the presentation to the committee on sustainability and resiliency. I'm wearing two hats. My name is Peter Dugas. I'm from Portland, lifelong Mainer. I am the Maine State Coordinator and recently retired Northeast Regional Director for Citizens Climate Lobby. We're a 250,000 plus volunteer organization from every congressional district, every state, and some international presence, working for effective and equitable climate policy. Emphasizing if it's bipartisan, we know that makes it much more resilient to the ebbs and flows of the political system. We're aiming for the the highest levels of policy making. I'm also wearing a hat at it's the CCL. Climate Interactive is an organization, it's a nonprofit under the auspices of the MIT Sloan School of Management that works on providing free tools for climate education, climate policy education. The centerpiece of this presentation will hopefully be interactive, and we'll talk about using the MIT's En-ROADS model. Just a show of hands, has anybody played with that model before? Okay, Paul, you're an obvious one. Okay, very good. Okay, so that's good. So what's what we do? A little bit about myself first. I graduated with a degree in physics and engineering from Brown University in 1997. I was doing data entry in the mid-90s, the Clinton administration, makes me feel so old, doing data entry on climate and was realizing how scary the numbers were looking, and being a 20-year-old kid, leaning on my professor and asked, gosh, doc, this doesn't look good. Help me feel better about the trajectory we're on. And he kind of put on the, typical emotionless, just the facts, scientific persona and said, well, kid, you got to look at this and study also the humanity that's doing this to itself as a phenomenon outside of just the climate science, and to knowingly and willingly drive this bus off a cliff. And I was like, thanks, doc, it doesn't really help. So what I did know in that time frame that this was going to be a growing concern as I got older, passed around a few different careers. And the scary thing is, in that conversation in 1997, we looked, at the moment we were just coming out with the Kyoto Accords, which was landmark. We had the Montreal Protocol about less than 10 years before that. So really landmark achievements in kind of getting a scientific consensus and policy workers together in the same direction. In the 28 years, 27 years since that conversation, humanity has emitted more carbon dioxide in those past 27 years than in all of human history before that. Well, so we were already in trouble in 1997, and it's even bleaker, and we're seeing it, right? I mean, one of the reasons we are working on this is trying to avoid the Appalachian Ridge becoming a hurricane zone, or to avoid Los Angeles getting incinerated in January. But I promise you that this was, so there's gonna be some dark stuff to deal with, but fortunately, I do think that there's a tremendous amount of hope just being armed with the top scale, highest level thinking, most up-to-date peer-reviewed studies on where the climate policy is, climate science is, and what we can do about it. So if I don't remember to be hopeful, please raise your hand and remind me to be hopeful. One other thing I would say is there's a pitch that I'm doing this. The reason why I'm doing this for free for all over Maine towns is because Maine, we happen to sit, and this is a very hopeful thing, in the most influential corner of the most influential country on this global policy. And that may surprise you. First of all, Maine's doing tremendous work on this, on the local, state level, and regional level. From the bipartisan group that the governor has collected for the Maine World Weight to make sure that we're a national leader and international leader on taking care of our own carbon and greenhouse gas emissions is wonderful. But let's go through some slides actually. I know I'll talk a little bit about this. Oh, you have to, there you go. Okay. So a lot of this is probably stuff old news. This is 800,000 years of history, from scientific data. Yes, when your friends and all that say, but carbon emissions have gone up and down, and atmospheric carbon levels have gone up and down throughout history. Yes, that's true. Human history is just this tiny little portion of the right-hand side of this, but you can see where we are as it's pushing beyond, hovering around 420 or a little bit more now. Next slide, please. And you can see that correlation, that's what we just saw in 800,000 years. The right-hand half of that is the green line above. So that, yes, CO2 concentration has gone up and down, and it's not a perfect match, but you can see how global temperature rises and falls with the rise and fall of that CO2 level. We know that there's at least 24 different robust, independent lines of scientific inquiry trying to disprove the fact that CO2 levels are actually associated with global temperature. But it's the scientific method has shown us that yes, a lot of it is driven because of our emissions. And of course, sea level rise follows that on the bottom. And you can see on the tail end, we are well past anywhere we've been in all of human history and eons before that. Next slide. And this is even more recent information and smaller timeline. The orange line along the bottom is from 1850 to 1900, the baseline of where temperatures were on average. So in those 50 years, we can see that January 1st is on the left-hand side, December 31st would be on the right-hand side. That baseline shows where temperatures were on the land. And each of those wiggly lines going that slides above that is basically a different year. The bluer is the line, the older the year. So you can see where degrees Celsius above that baseline is that wiggly blue line, and as they get whiter, they get more and more recent. Well, most alarming is where we were, and this is the last data that's available in 2043, which is just off the charts. You can see that's predicted quite scary. I would say this, and I got close to saying this in my preamble and get distracted. I'm going to actually make a pitch. One of the reasons why I'm taking this from town to town is to talk to Maine towns about what they can do to lend a voice to our very influential federal and international policymakers on climate. It's become something that every town is grappling with the ever increasing costs associated with climate related events like last year's crazy rainstorms we had in January that made almost every Maine town's public works budget explode. There's only so much that you can do, the city of Bath itself and our residents, to slow down our own carbon emissions. But even within the whole state, we can lend our voices as long as we're coupling individual actions and stuff, and we can aggregate our voices for higher actions. Next slide, please. So that's where I was talking about. Now, when I say hope, being hopeful and showing these faces on the screen, what I meant to say was that we are in the, as I said, I would argue the most influential corner of the most influential state, the most influential country on this, because as we speak, there's one climate policy that we will play with that I will lead you towards. It's nothing's going to get us all the way there, but to get the United States to join what is now every other developed nation in the world, which has some form of a price or downward pressure on carbon pollution, does a tremendous amount, as we'll see when we play with the En-ROAD model in MIT's En-ROAD model. And, the two folks on the left there, Susan Collins and Angus King, we are in the only state with both of our senators on the bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. That's a distinction that we've had for quite a while. The bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus is got an even number of Republicans and Democrats. There's 6 Republicans, including Susan Collins, 6 Democrats, well, actually 5 true Democrats plus one guy who's an independent caucus of Democrats, which is Angus King. We are the only state with both of our senators on that board. We have on that caucus. New York has 20 times our population. Texas, roughly 30 times our population. California, roughly 40 times our population. They all have 0. So next slide. If you were actually to look at the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions coming from Maine, you've got that tiny little sliver. The math is 0.27%. I couldn't get a second decimal place on that. But it's wonderful what Maine's doing in making ourselves a national and international leader on this. But do you think by addressing that little sliver is going to save, I don't know, lobsters from leaving the Gulf of Maine if it gets too warm? Or they're going to go the same direction Maine Trim did, right? Who here remembers Maine Trim? Right. I know, I'm so sad. How many millennia do you think that they were in the Gulf of Maine, right? I mean, that's kind of like a gallows of humor I use is you can still get Maine Shrimp. That's the good news. The bad news is you have to read them to get them. But we have this large portion on the right of where that Senate Climate Solutions Caucus is. 2 out of the 12. A lot of the great stuff that was contained in climate on the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Bill and the CHIPS Act, which came between them, particularly the bipartisan infrastructure bill, came from that austere group. Record-breaking amounts of money allocated towards addressing clean energy, addressing energy efficiency, addressing climate in general. But as we know, we need to do a lot. Next slide. Okay, so we'll talk predominantly about carbon pricing because that's the cornerstone policy, but just so you know, Citizens Climate Lobby itself, there's 2 different, as many of these organizations, there's Citizens Climate Education, which is kind of what I'm doing right now, explaining these things. We'll do this interactive workshop together. The lobby end of things, you have to have a distinct arm for that because of where the fundraising goes. So one's a 501c3, one's a 501c4, just for total transparency. The big policy areas that we tend to work on are the ones that are, our criteria for choosing what we push our political clout behind are: 1, is it effective in helping the climate problem? 2, is it equitable? Does it help particularly the bottom 2/3 of income levels? Because if it's hurting them, we don't want to, that's something we want to avoid. And 3, does it have bipartisan potential? And what the big 4 categories that we've been working on are what we see here. So carbon pricing, again, we'll spend most of our time explaining that because it's the wonkiest, but also the most effective. And clean energy permitting reform, which is something that we're actually doing quite a bit of in the short term. After passing the Inflation Reduction Act, we found in our conversations with our lawmakers that the bottleneck preventing us from harvesting what we thought would be the clean energy assets coming in from the Inflation Reduction Act, what's slowing it down is the tremendous slow movement of permitting, trying to get that. So that has opportunities for bipartisanship. Everyone loves the idea of solar and wind until they see it in their backyard, right? And there's or if there's there is no perfect solution, so we're going to have to lean on that. And cleaning up and speeding up the process is helpful. Senator King is actually a tremendous advocate for that. When he was governor, he said, there is no transition without transmission. We're going to have to talk about power lines. So you can't say you love electric vehicles without considering onshoring some mining. If we don't mine it here, where we have high standards for environmental protection and for human rights, we're going to continue to allow it to happen in Indonesia and China and other places where they have almost zero standards for human rights or environmental pollution. Healthy forests, which is obviously a no-brainer to try to sequester using natural solutions some of the atmospheric carbon that we have that's already baked into the system that's in the atmosphere. And then finally, building electrification and energy efficiency. A lot of that, of course, we got across the finish line in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. However, we need more. So, next slide, please. So at this point, I'm actually going to explain the En-ROADS model. If I can change windows, and I might change seats with you if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
And we can just chat about it. So, oops. There you go. So, Bill and I love this thing. So, what better endorsement this? So, if you're really interested in this model, let's see, it'd be right there. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
Let me get rid of this again.
Oh, I see what you're doing. Yeah. We're barely going to be able to scratch the surface of this. I had been put in the position of being, Citizens Climate has volunteer liaisons to each of the offices. I was in Angus King's liaison role, which meant I had to meet with him 2 or 3 times a year, and his staff to talk about climate policy and what was possible in that particular moment. When this was rolled out, I saw a beta run of this, I guess, fall of 2019. I signed up immediately to be in the first class of folks that could, officially and publicly become an En-ROADS climate ambassador. So lead one of these workshops. You can go ahead this is free and easy to use online. And the nice thing about it is that it's relatively user friendly. And it's an aggregate model showing the entire, thank you. Showing how, good. Does everyone see this okay? Good. Okay, great. So we're going to be able to there's a lot of things that this model does. You can look at all of these different things to look at sea level rise, temperature change, greenhouse gas emission by gas type. We may dig into that one a bit later. Sources of energy, cost of energy, cost of electricity, all these different things. I usually default to this, which is, what are we looking at here? This is a global model, right? So I guess if you're going to call it a shortcoming or is to show that this is across the average across the entire globe, across the entire world. So you can see where we were a couple of years after I graduated from school at 0.78 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and this temperature has gone up to now where we at 1.38 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and you can see where we're supposed to be projected to hit by the end of the century. Of course, this is global, so it's like at the poles, it's less. At the poles, it's more, and around the equator would be less. But this is a global model. Anybody have any idea what this dash line might be at 1.5? Yeah, exactly, Frederick. Right. So this is in 2015. The global leaders we had were our COP. What was it? COP 20 at that point? Yeah, where we all agreed that the nations were going to stay at 1.5 degrees or less to avoid the positive feedback loops that might kick in if we get past certain thresholds, after which we would have very little control no matter what we did to try to keep temperatures from increasing. So you can see we're bouncing up against that projected in this model by the end of the decade, right? We'll be hitting it in 5 years. There's been more thinking saying it's not like a yes or no answer. There's gradations of gray. It's kind of like, I hate to bring up this, but like exercise or dieting, right? It's like you could always do better. So maybe we'll be okay if we stay below 2 degrees, all right? So there's that line there, okay? There'll be some sacrifices to have to make, we'll lose some coastline, we'll lose coral reefs, we'll lose some species for sure. But, and beyond that, it just gets worse. One good point of news is that this number here, which I'm keeping to centigrade because 1.5, I could switch it to Fahrenheit, but 1.5 is easier to look at than whatever it is in centigrade to Fahrenheit. So if you don't mind, if you like Fahrenheit, you can stay down here under the 6 degrees. But one key piece of good news is that just in the 5 years since this model became available, this number, when it was first rolled out and I first showed it to Angus King and his staff, was 4.1. So we've actually bent this curve down considerably. A lot of that, there's a couple of different factors. Some of it is the baseline of like what year we're starting with, but a lot of it is actually how much cheaper renewable energy, particularly solar, has been getting so much cheaper than even the biggest booster of the industry might have even thought just 5 years ago. So that's all good news. So now we're at this level. Some of it's also just because of policy. This got whittled down a bit when the world's biggest economy, the US, decided to pony up and start doing some actions like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law before that. But on the left is really where we should be looking. And this is where our sources of energy are coming from. So the red line, as you can read on the bottom, is oil. Black is coal, the dirtiest and most plentiful fossil fuel in the world, even though it's kind of losing market share in the United States because of fracking revolution, which is making gas much cheaper. So that's the blue line. So those are the 3 fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas in descending order of how much CO2 they release into the atmosphere. Then we've got renewables, this green line. It's good news that by the end of the century, it's got a plurality or it grows to an extent where it's bigger than any other single source. We also have bioenergy, this burning wood chips and other things here along this purplish line. Existing nuclear is this blue line down here at the bottom, and they also have like a continuous zero line, which is a new zero carbon source of energy that we may not be anticipating. So if fusion becomes marketable and scalable, that's an example of a new zero carbon source of energy. You could get in deeper into the world of sci-fi and think of the flux capacitor or vibranium or something like that. Okay. And intentionally, this model doesn't put numbers on any of these things unless you dig in. If you really want to see the numbers, you can click on these 3 dots in any of these categories and see, well, I can do a much more nuanced approach to this. I can actually read up on what the numbers mean and also what peer-reviewed study this all comes from. You can really climb nerd mountain using this model if you wanted to. I did the 8-week training. It was really fun and it's free. Did I mention it's free? So I enjoyed it. And you really do feel like there are some things that come out of this model that may be surprising, that are like counterintuitive. So that's why they suggest that you take this. But notice where these sliders are this is basically not using a magic wand. If I were to slide this down and making coal just go away, is basically I'm trying to use market incentives using like taxes or mandates or something like that to either force coal down or renewables up or vice versa, God forbid. So, this has got, the model itself has over 1,600 different equations and algorithms in it, not only about climate science and energy, but also about international trade and energy markets. So what we're looking at over here, these 8 categories show us where our energy supply is coming from: coal, oil, natural gas, bioenergy, renewables, nuclear, that crazy new zero carbon and carbon pricing. That's the supply. The demand side, supply for energy, but which also means greenhouse gas emissions. And then the demand side is how we're using all that energy. So transportation, how we're moving ourselves and our goods and services around, the energy efficiency of that, the electrification of that, buildings and industry, we can do the same thing, energy efficiency and electrification of that. We can look at scaling back population growth and economic growth. I'm not sure how much we really want to wish a slowdown of that because we're pulling people out of poverty globally on this, but that's something to look at. Then carbon dioxide removal, we can either talk about nature-based carbon dioxide removal or technological, which is anything from bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is like putting in basically like encouraging lichens and blue-green algae in this oceans to, there's all kinds of different categories of this. There's also mineralization, which is like limestone, which actually naturally reacts with atmospheric carbon, so sequester it. Yeah. Agricultural emissions, a lot of emissions, predominantly less CO2, but more methane, and then waste and leakage also coming from methane and transporting that around in our pipelines, and then deforestation, the rate at which we're cutting down our world's forests, which help to be the lungs for the planet and scrub our atmosphere from some of that atmospheric carbon. So that's a long explanation. Again, I would, you can, maybe I'll do this and show this one. I kind of like this too, because we can still see the temperature numbers here. And this gives you an idea of where these emissions are coming from. So number one is that charcoal gray is fossil fuel CO2. After that, there's CO2 coming from how we're misusing our land just by cutting down forests and letting it rot, which, this country does a better job at than others, but we could always do better. Then CH4, which is methane. There's nitrous oxide and F gases or trace gases. So at this point, I've already talked too much. What I would recommend is just, let's have a conversation. What might you like to see modeled on this global policy model and see what it looks like as we try to bend this number down and bring this greenhouse gas emission down? Sure, yeah. Yes. Yeah, good. No, it's a good question. So you're right. It is human waste. A lot of it is that, methane comes a lot from from landfill gases and that sort of thing. Leakage is really like transporting natural gas is the big thing there. Natural gas is, CH4 is natural gas when we transport it, and we don't have a good inventory of the leakage coming out of that. That's just, it's depending on how you qualify it. It's between 30 and 90 times roughly the power of insulation or greenhouse gas power of a molecule of CO2. There's just a heck of a lot more of CO2 we're pumping in the atmosphere than methane. So that's really methane's is this blue stuff is coming from there, and the agricultural emissions. Methane, the nice thing about it is it has a much shorter half-life. It eventually just naturally, but it's like less than 10 years for the half of the methane that we release in the atmosphere to decouple and just deteriorate to carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide stays up there for centuries, for millennia. Yeah. Yes, that would be leakage too, Paul. Yeah. Oh. Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, yeah, and human bodily waste will have a component of this. This is supposed to aggregate all of that, and I don't know. I'm no expert in all of these things, but you can definitely see where this is coming from, and what proportion is creating all those different parts of the methane leakage. But in aggregate, it's this blue, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So you see an increase in capacity. We saw an increase in renewables. That would correlate to a decrease in the use of transportation because renewables would be providing for electrification.
Well, that's a good question. So we can look at that. If I could just grab this and yank it up. It's really a lot of it's depending. This is, if I were to adjust the renewables on this, that's what's providing us our electricity, Frederick. And it's not necessarily, there will be other things that are happening that are corollaries of that, but it's not assuming much beyond that. So we're just we're talking about where's our electricity coming from? We're ramping up the incentives for more renewables.
more solar panels and businesses, charging stations on the homes.
It-
Like we've seen happening in Maine and other.
Sure. Yeah, but that's assuming that we have a certain percentage of our vehicle fleet are electric, right? And that electricity is getting into the and into the grid and into those vehicles, right? So let's talk about this. You bring up two really good points. So let's explore how this works. So um electric vehicles, if I were gonna offer what I think it gets probably brought up, especially for a Maine audience, where a big rural state drives a lot of places in usually like beat up old cars or trucks. If I grab this and slide this all the way over, we can see what happens on the energy demand. You can imagine what might be happening there, right? What's going to, particularly this oil line, if we're electrifying our vehicle fleet. It's not just cars, it's also like, trains, ferries, and, to that extent. And you can also imagine what that means for this temperature. So let's do this. You've got sitting relatively near somebody. If I grab this slider and slide it all the way over, everything else being equal, what do you think that's going to do for this 6-degree number of Fahrenheit? Tell your neighbor. I don't think this is an officially betting parlor, so we can't put any wagers on this, but you can at least have bragging rights with your neighbor. No. Oh no, yeah. So that wouldn't be 100%. This is just going to the upper limits of incentives for electric vehicles for the world. But it's not 100% because we're basically, you can't model it as just being like a wave a magic wand and every vehicle becomes electric. It's basically putting in place the maximum amount of incentives that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sees as possible. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
In electrification of this small, tiny population base.
No, we're talking about, right. Well, the US is responsible between 10 and 15% of global emissions. We're no longer number one. China has beat us out. But of course, per capita, we're number one because there's a lot more Chinese than there are us. But this is global, Frederick. So when I do this, this is all over the world. This is China, US, everybody. So let's just take a look and see. So has everyone made their guesses? Oh, yeah. Right, exactly. Oh, good. You're smart about this. Okay. All right, ready? Okay, I'm gonna grab this. All right, and I slide this over, and I like seeing what's happening on the left, right? We see red line going down and the green line going up. And every step in the right direction is good. So we've gone from 6 degrees expected Fahrenheit increased temperature by the end of the century to 5.87.
So,
That's right. But well, all we've done is, yeah. Right. Well, not necessarily, because look, check this out. It says electrification is, we've highly subsidized electric vehicles. So just think about electric cars for now to make just be simple. Here we are, and this is nice because you can see business as usual, the trajectory we're on, and highly subsidized electric vehicles. I love the green line going up. I love the red line going down. What else is moving on the left that's concerning? Yes, good job. Who said that? Good job. Yeah. So you see if we're talking about just more electric vehicles, and that's the only thing we're asking, or more subsidies for electric vehicles, in a place like Maine or Quebec, a lot of places, Europe, that's really impactful because we've got a relatively green grid. It could be better, but we're in good spots. It's less good in places like the Dakotas or West Virginia, where they still have significant coal, and it's particularly ineffective or like doesn't do much if we're talking about developing countries like Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, where you're talking about just more electrical demand. That means more coal. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead, Frederick.
Because we extrapolate from like the last 10 or 12 years of electric car growth with the increase increase in renewables.
Yep.
commensurate with the increase of electrification.
Right. Sure.
So if that electrification is going up, I think we can say it is reasonable to assume that there'd be somewhat of a correlate, like we've seen in the last 12 years, increase in renewables.
Oh yeah, and we see that. Take a look. Watch this again. Watch the renewable sign does go up. Yeah. Yeah, so we're seeing oil go down and renewables go up, but at the same time, we're seeing coal go up, which if you're switching out oil for coal, that's a loss for the climate. Coal is much worse for the climate than oil is. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Love it. Okay, great. All right. You guys, who wants to make a bet? I'll give you 3 seconds before I slide this all the way over. This is fun, right? Come tell your neighbor what you think it's going to be when we slide this down. No one's saying anything. Are you guys all skittish? Remember, we're going to end on optimism, right, everybody? Okay, so here we go. We're going to grab this and I slide this up. Boom. I love seeing renewables. I'm not waving a magic wand. I'm just highly subsidizing. I'm maximizing the subsidies for solar, wind, onshore and offshore, hydro, and to make this ramp up. Okay, and I've shaved off 1/10 of a degree centigrade or 2/10 of a degree Fahrenheit. Now, exactly, right. So what's happening here? Check out what's going on. And I love seeing, remember, so I think the goal that you had about like keeping an eye on coal is important because coal is the one that's most worried, right? That's globally the most plentiful and the dirtiest fossil fuel. And I see that's nice in the next decade when I ramp this up, that coal goes way down. But this is why it's important to not just think about the world as a climate scientist, but also to think about an economist. What happens, I've artificially, and honestly, this is what we did with the Inflation Reduction Act, was we ramped up renewable incentives, along with electrification, a lot of other things. But this is one of the big key things we did. When we highly subsidize renewables, it's cheaper artificially for us to go with renewables over traditional things. So coal goes way down. What happens after a decade of no one buying coal? What happens to all that coal that used to go to the market? What happens to the price of it? Right. What happens when it goes down low enough? People buy it again because it's attractive. It's a classic Econ 101 rebound effect. It's like, okay, it hits the floor. Wait, anyone notice that coal is like super cheap now? Let's start buying it again. And that's why it maintains. See? Yeah, we could look at that. I don't think that that's anything. It's a heck of a lot easier to pass giving incentives, giving money away than it is to put penalties on anything. Just look at healthcare and Obamacare, for instance, right? It's like really difficult to do stuff. Yeah, go ahead. Sadly, no. There is another, the precursor to this was called C-Roads, which is still available. I don't play with it very often in public because it doesn't really tell you anything about the policy. It just says what different regions of the world have to keep their carbon emissions down to in order to avoid catastrophe. In order for them to just be workable and have it be in real time, they have to kind of have it be a global model. But so unfortunately, no, but it does help to kind of know, just think about you just breaking down what US percentage of carbon emissions are, 10 to 20, 15%, and then you can think about why global policies are important. But that's what we're looking at. Yeah, I will. I will. All right. Can I do a couple more just to make sure? Okay. Go ahead, Fred. Oh, I'm sorry. More questions. I promise I won't get off of that. I will get there. Sure. Oh, good question. Yeah. So thankful if I do, this is a different one I don't often get to. This actually shows like global population, right? First quarter of this is history. The rest is projections, right? Using the latest UN thinking. There's actually quite a bit of controversy about this. We're actually getting to reduced fertilization rates in a lot of parts of the world faster than we thought we would. But if I grab this, so you do that, global GDP per capita And look at the little bumps where 2008 economic crisis and COVID, energy intensity of that GDP, there are also bumps, carbon intensity, and then carbon emissions. If I take this population and slide it down, I've peaked and started going down earlier. GDP per capita, because energy intensity of GDP doesn't change, but the CO2 emissions from energy deviates from this. So we've shaved off 0.2 of a degree. Now, this is just a model, remember. So it's like, this doesn't, if we had like catastrophic die-offs, that's something we don't want to wish for, but it would have a different look, right? Okay. What was the other thing before I get to the happy story? Because I do want to get to the happy story, or should I just go there? Nuclear. Okay, great. Nuclear, very similar. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah, let me reset that. Boom. Population. Nuclear. If I grab this and slide this all the way over, again, you can see, let's just take a look at that. It's similar to, surprisingly, first of all, it takes a long time to build existing nuclear power plants, right? I mean, like existing technology. It does shave things off, right? We have to worry about the waste. But the same thing happens that happened when we ramped up renewables. Coal goes down, but not nearly as, it doesn't stay down. Notice also we've gone, everything goes down, right? We're like, everything else being equal, it's eating a lot of coal, but it's also eating a lot of renewables. Let's do one other thing. If I actually did, let's say fusion and nuclear get ramped up, which is, there's a lot of talk about this. So suddenly, let's say mid-century fusion actually becomes marketable and, we've shaved this up. Again, coal goes down, but it, again, doesn't go away. So we have to be worried about this. You're seeing a trend here, right? What about planting 1 trillion trees? A few years ago, everyone was talking about that, particularly people who really liked keeping the incentives that kept coal and natural gas around. So it's like, let's just mop the atmosphere up with planting 1 trillion trees. So let's slide this over, and that's great. I'm now sequestering. Let's actually double that with slowing down the rate at which we're cutting the world's forests. And we've taken a big chunk on this. This is now, we've gotten like 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year by the end of the century getting sucked in from the atmosphere. However, you got to compare that with the 41 plus gigatons of CO2 we're still pumping in the atmosphere every year. Right. So you can just see this is the reason I like this model, because it shows the scale of like how much we can mop things up versus how much we're pumping in there. Okay. So this is the reason why, as I said at the beginning, we are the only state with both senators on the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. So we have outsized leverage. We are the only country and also the largest economy in the world still without some form of carbon pollution. If you don't take anything else from this model, the 2 lessons I would say is, 1, there's no silver bullet. We need a lot of things to go right. But 2, you can't get there with just the carrots, with just the goodies going towards virtuous things like energy efficiency and renewables and electrification of vehicles. We also have to put downward pressure on carbon. So in the summer of 2022, our most stressful meetings with our lawmakers, because it was, if you remember correctly, that was like our last chance to get the reconciliation package, which was called Build Back Better and ended up being called Inflation Reduction Act. We had 49 of the 50 necessary senators on board, right? We needed 50 senators to get a carbon price similar to this, which started off at $25 per ton of CO2 per year. And it went up every year for the next 75 years by $10 a year. So $10 over 75 years is what? $750 plus the original. Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry. Let me step back up. Good point. A carbon price is basically, you can think of it as, it depends what you do with the money. It could be a call to tax or it could be just a price, is basically applying a fee where we extract the stuff out of the ground. So as far upstream as possible is the thinking, means that there is no way for you to play whack-a-mole, like, oh, it's not coming out of my car, it's coming out of the electrical plant, which is burning coal down the street, right? If we apply it where it's being pulled out of the ground, and every government in the world takes very good inventory of what they're pulling out of the ground in oil, coal, and natural gas, and we price it or put a penalty against it proportional to how dirty it is. So coal gets hit the worst, then oil, then natural gas. And it goes up by $10 a year over 75 years is 750 plus the initial $50. Again, doesn't do everything, but look what it does. So this is relatively minor carbon price. It does, not only does it ramp up renewables, but it also puts a big wet blanket, particularly on coal and natural gas, and later on when oil catches up afterwards. Okay. That's for global. But exactly. Remember, though, the US is the only developed nation without it. So most of the world's economies are already on board with this. They have they're inching their way forward to doing something like this. It's a big patchwork and it's really complicated, of course. The EU is particularly motivated to increase their carbon price, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've learned the lesson the hard way, what it meant to turn a blind eye towards the bad actors that were supplying them their cheap energy. So for political reasons, they are ramping up. They're approaching already $200 equivalent per ton of CO2. China, which everyone in the States points a finger to, being like, why should we act when China's is now eclipsed us in terms of emissions? They have a $5 per ton of CO2. That's much too small. But the important thing, and we'll get to this in a second, is that the global consensus is coming around to carbon pricing of some form. It depends what we do with that money in the end. But the EU, starting January 1st, 2026, the EU and the UK will start applying carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs, which is carbon tariffs, basically, on goods coming into their common market proportional to the difference between the carbon price. So China will get, so basically it's like, imagine you run a German steel plant. Okay. Oh, I didn't know that. I just guessed. Okay, so you got a German steel plant. You're not really happy about the EU making this decision to put a price on carbon. That's going to increase your costs. And you're worried that you're thinking about, well, maybe I'll move my steel plant to Russia or Saudi Arabia or Libya or the only developed nation without a carbon price, the US, or maybe China, which has a very small one. So what they do is the EU protects you by any import coming into your market. The EU is going to be going to have that fee applied to it. So Chinese steel, which may be cheaper to manufacture because they're burning coal, they're going to get hit with that tariff so that it can't be cheaper than your steel. So you can still provide it to your clients. Does that make sense? Well, that does two things. It protects you, the business, but more importantly, it exports the policy. Because if China starts getting hit with a carbon tariff, they're going to say like, well, thank you very much. We'd rather keep that money. So we'll level the playing field, up our carbon price so that we can have that. In fact, since the EU has announced that they are applying that carbon tariff next year, the Chinese has expanded and is talking about increasing their carbon price to keep up, or at least make up some of the ground. Canada and other countries are joining. You can imagine how that's going to affect the US starting after January 1st, regardless of all the mess that's going on in Washington right now. Just think of what's going to happen when the timber industry in Maine tries to sell lumber to Europeans or Canadians if they join the carbon tariff scheme. That's going to, or lobstermen. The Maine Lobstermen Association tried to sell lobsters to fancy French restaurants, and suddenly they're so much more expensive because of those tariffs than they would be if they were coming from Nova Scotia, because they're in the same market. That's going to make a lot of angry people calling our senators, right? So this is not far from the truth once the largest economy jumps on board. Yeah. Okay, so we're lobstermen. Lobster people? What do we call it? Whatever. We're selling lobsters. And we used to be able to sell to fancy French restaurants. So I got like a great client over there. Suddenly, starting January 1st, 2026, they're going to be applying because in Europe, this carbon pricing is hitting their lobster, whatever, their fishermen fleets for the diesel that they're using on their outboard engines. That's not something we have to deal with here. So in order to make it even, they're applying that fee against imports coming into their market, which means from us, which don't have a carbon price, to theirs. So they're applying that difference of how much it affects their product. Canada's on board, so they're going to be the same. Does that make sense? So they're in a common market. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. Well, right, and that, okay.
I want to sell in France and Germany, they want some sort of proof from me that my packaging is totally recyclable.
Yes, interesting.
And just as me, I'm like.
Right.
I think they have some rules that might let me through because I'm so small, but it's still sitting on one of my, my websites where I sell. It's like, you still haven't filled out that you're not,
Oh, we're kidding. Wow.
I don't know. I'm so confused that I'm like, I sell one book every 5 years to France.
Right.
Saying that everybody who sells books on these platforms we now have to provide paperwork because that it's, and that's just packaging. So yeah, it's already, things like that are already happening.
Well, that's great. I mean, and first of all, good for the EU for biting, into this because they have a lot at stake, right? I mean, they're already, they're losing a lot, just like a lot of parts of the world are because of this problem. So they're being leaders on this, and it's also a lot of it is geopolitical because they're so afraid of what's going on their eastern flanks, right? It took 3 years for them to decide. Like they basically said this is coming, and it took 3 years for them to get the calculations, and they're rolling it out on certain products in time. So because the calculations now, it's funny that you bring this up because when we were down in DC in June talking to Republican lawmakers, they do this great training to make sure how do you talk to a progressive like Shelley Pingree or Bernie Sanders? How do you talk to? We always bring way more Mainers than we need for just 4 lawmakers. So there was 40 of us, and I was just coming out of this great meeting with Angus King, always very high level, very smart, very funny. He's a funny guy. And I sent a message to my wife being like, where did the algorithm send you? Because they always send the Mainers into other meetings to help populate these other places where they're having a hard time getting people. And she just sent me a picture of her meeting with Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, joining the Texas team, which was on our Christmas card. That you had to put that on the Christmas card. So, and I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And she's like, no, don't apologize. It was fascinating. First of all, they trained us so well. Don't talk about climate. Don't talk about clean energy. Just talk about, emphasize a lot of market innovation, unleash the powers of the market to get and streamline and eliminating red tape to get us to move. We knew that by saying this, it was good for him. It was going to be a political win for him for his conservative credibility. We also knew that 95% of the energy projects going into Texas are clean, or they're solar and wind. That's currently. That's what the cue is. But he also talked about one of the big things that Republicans, this is why I'm so excited to be part of Citizens Climate Lobby, even in these dire times, the Republicans are coming on board the carbon price because they realize a lot of business folks know that we can make it with less carbon intensity here than we can abroad. That's bringing, like accelerating kind of the stuff that Biden had started, bringing onshoring a lot of our manufacturing. But it's also one of the things, there's something called the, there was a small piece of legislature we were trying to get support. Prove It Act, it was called, which is basically we don't trust the EU's numbers. We want to make sure we're doing our own calculations because it's like, why do we dare trust them when they're going to cook the numbers in their direction to their benefit? So it's basically, but it starts the conversation with Republicans to talk about carbon pricing is coming. And the pressure on the U.S. is only going to intensify as those prices keep going on, and we're on the receiving end of those tariffs. Does that make sense? So, anyways, let me continue with this. So, this you can see, we were shaving things down by like 1/10 or 2/10 of a degree. This, oh wait, I did. Okay, yeah, sorry, I got to go back to this because we did a small carbon price first, and then it's actually 3.3 to the carbon price. If you can see how much this does. Not only does it increase renewables, but it puts a big wet blanket over coal, oil, and natural gas from this one policy. Again, doesn't do everything we need, but but you can see why the UN has said in all of its past six reports from COP that a carbon pricing is quote unquote a necessary condition for stabilizing the climate. In other words, with a carbon price, we have a chance of doing this. Without, we don't. But let's continue this. So if we actually talk about the number 2 thing we've talked about is methane. Let's deal with those nasty landfills and cleaning up those pipeline leaks. And now we're already at 2 degrees. And if we talk about, let's do some nature-based efficiency, slowing down the rate in which we're cutting the world's forests, and maybe planting some of that lichen, and we can get to that happy 1.5. So it's possible. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work. Well, it wasn't for me. I just had to slide some sliders around. But and if you don't like seeing windmills off the coast of Maine or solar farms everywhere, then do some energy efficiency, and that brings that way down. Does that make sense? Anyways, I'm happy. I could talk about this model all day, but you can see why I like this model, because it shows 2 things. It's not easy. There is no silver bullet, but nothing does. We need something that not just give carrots away to the good, virtuous stuff, but puts a penalty on the problems of carbon pricing. Okay. So the big question now is, what do we do? Can you help me out? I don't remember how you did this. Hey, I'll switch with you. I'll go with them. Thank you. Yeah, we can get back to that. I don't really have a problem on that much, but, So that's a lot of information that's embedded in that, and I hope that made sense. But you can see why I like to marry the Emirates model, because it comes from your ideas got put into this. Next slide. So the question is, just a little bit more about carbon pricing. Great Britain's a great example of a carbon price. They implemented theirs in 2013. And in a mere 6 years, their carbon emissions fell by 61%. This is actually to update this. They just retired their last coal-generated electric vehicle, and predominantly because of how expensive it was in carbon pricing. Keep going. If this doesn't convince you, nothing will. 20-year study of 142 nations. Each circle or triangle is a different nation. The 43 countries with the carbon price are those black triangles. All of them plateaued and then started going down in carbon emissions, 100%. In the remaining 99 countries, which had some other policy, 80% of them continued to increase their emissions. Does that make sense?
England go that when they increase their use,
they have a lot of offshore wind.
Yeah.
Continue, I'm sorry. I'll be done. This is just another, my cohort in New Hampshire made this model, which is basically, there's a competitive advantage that we're losing out on. If you just did the science as the gray line, that's like the carbon price that's necessary for us to achieve that 1.5 target is that gray line. And you can see where we are as, that red line is us at the bottom because we haven't participated. The EU has got a kind of a crazy system because it's a conglomerate of a lot of patchwork. So it's a little bit of a bumpy ride. Canada's more streamlined ride. But look they're on path to do this. The longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be to catch it. Both climate-wise, but economic. But the question is, what do we do with that money? If we just, carbon pricing is an umbrella term. We could have it just be a carbon tax where and that's effective on climate, but it's not equitable, right? Because it's like the people who are going to get hurt economically are the ones who are paying for, making ends meet, trying to drive a long way, and whatever vehicle they might have that's gas powered to work on minimum wage job or whatever it might be, right? Those people do not want to see their gas prices go. So that's just ask Macron how it went when he tried to increase the gas tax in France a few years ago, right? There was the Gilets Jaunes movement. You could have a cap and trade, which the Europeans have had now for decades. Still not perfect because you can greenwash and hide where emissions are coming from, but it's still much better than nothing where we got. But we like, and still not perfect there, but the closest analogy to what our bill was pushing for, which again,
had one vote shy of being included in the Inflation Reduction Act, had 97 co-sponsors in the House, including Shelley Paley, briefly existed as a bipartisan, bicameral, had bipartisan support in both House and Senate. We've lost some of the Republicans that were supporting that. But that would put a gradually increasing fee at the source, coal, oil, and natural gas, proportional to how dirty it is when you burn it. But the net revenue, 100% of that money is just returned to as a dividend check to every man, woman, and child. This was happening in Canada. It's a little bit. There's been a couple of bumpy roads, problems with rolling it out, but we've learned our lessons from them. In Canada, if we were to get in a bus and drive up to Moncton, New Brunswick, everybody's getting $736 back per person per year, paid for without increasing the size of the Canadian government, all just by penalizing the fossil fuel industry that has known about this problem for decades. Now, you could say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to just take in money that I'm getting from the backs of the fossil fuel providers. Why don't I just take that, they're just going to take that check and go to the gas station or go to the heating oil guy, which is true. Some people are obviously going to do that in the short term. But what happens next time your car fails and you need a new car? You'll be like, I get an EV. Everything's going to be cheaper. What happens when everybody's motivated for economic reasons, not just because they're trying to be good for the planet, then the price of EVs go down, which is already happening. Heat pumps become more popular because I'm saving that dividend check if I'm not paying the oil bill. Do you see how that works? So, and more importantly, it moves the burden from me and you and people who would sacrifice a Wednesday night to come and learn about dorky climate policy. It moves the burden from us who want to do well to the folks who are actually most sensitive to price fluctuations, the folks who are providing us our goods and services. So if I'm running a shipping industry or a steel company or a lobstering or something, and I'm trying to get a competitive edge over my competition, if I can do that with an EV, then also I'm doing it cheaper because my expenses for fuel is going to be much less. Then it's just moving the entire market in that direction, which is why it's so powerful. Next slide. We've actually modeled how this works across the country, but even in Maine. And on the left, you can see this is percentage of change of after-tax income. When you give the money back to people, there's no strings attached. It's got conservative support because there's no earmarking, there's no means testing. We're just taking that money and giving it back to people. The poorer folks, because they have smaller carbon footprint, are actually benefiting the most. And everybody from 70% down benefits, right? And the folks on the hot part, 30%, it's less than 2% for the wealthiest of them. And don't feel too bad for them. They're the ones who can most afford to decarbonize their lifestyle. Maybe take fewer flights, right? Don't fly as much. Don't have a second home, or if you do have a second home, put heat pumps on it, or whatever it might be. You can actually see the percentage of households that benefit go up the further inland, the poorer interior parts of the state. And then the wealthy coastal elite is still 50% or so of us do well.
What's that?
I know. I don't know what that is. It's got to be
Cool, when 5 people live in one county.
Exactly. I don't know what that is. It's got to be somebody who's wealthy in that one spot, who's just in a very low populated area that flipped everything over. It's not Bangalore because Bangalore is further left. Yeah. Continue. So this is the same kind of thing we're looking at. This is the green is the money that you're getting back, and this is just the first month. The first year of the model. So no one's getting rich off of $514 back in a year. But you can see that and the bottom number is how much more goods and services are going to increase in cost because of that carbon price in the short term. But you can see it's taxable income, so the green goes down as the policy rolls out. But the bottom 60% are net beneficiaries. Are barely, what do you go, $42 there? That's not going to kill anybody in that spot, and it's motivating them to decarbonize. And the top earners, they're not going to go broke off with that. But and again, don't feel bad for them. They're the ones who can most easily decarbonize because of their affluence. But notice the funny thing is this: the difference in colors: the blue, the light blue, and gray. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Right, so the dark blue is direct energy costs, and the light blue is indirect energy costs. So what do you think that means?
Like how much energy is used to make something?
Yeah, so exactly. So the direct energy cost is like me, the consumer, paying for my gas for my car, oil for my furnace, electrical component, which, we're doing okay, we're good to do that. That's the dark blue. Indirect energy costs is all the stuff you don't think about. That's got a bajillion middlemen between where the products or services bought and where the emissions are hit. So stuff like me getting my cup of coffee in the morning, it's got all that carbon embedded that I don't know where it's coming from, who's responsible for it. Or me taking a flight, or me taking a photo of my vacation and putting it in the cloud. Do you ever think about the carbon emissions associated with that, or getting an Amazon thing delivered to my door? That's actually, for most Americans, that's the vast majority of their carbon emissions are coming from just that. And that's why this is robust, is because it works on all those things. And the more affluent you are, the higher the proportion that is. But you're right, your financial assets are, if you're in the top 20%, that's an equitability thing too. But those people shouldn't be making money on polluting our atmosphere. And we got to bring that externality into the system. Next slide. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if I'm paying tax at the gas pump and then I get my dividend back and I'm paying tax on my dividend, it's taxed on the way out and on the way in.
Yeah. Welcome to the US government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just make
Bummer. Yeah, I know.
Bummer.
It's
And then-
taxable income, but
It would be paid after the fact.
technically, the way an economist would argue with this, and I'm on your side, but the economist would say it's not taxed the first time because we're giving that money back to you. It's taxed the second time when we give it back to you and we're sliding, whatever bracket you're in a bit off.
Okay, I'm not on this, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so if it's not considered a tax, if it wasn't, let's assume it's not taxed at all, and it's just the dividend, like it's a fee and dividend. That money, it's going to be a little bit more expensive at the gas pump, and that money is just going to be just redistributed evenly to every person in the country. When you redistribute that, it's not considered a tax because you're just taking the money and brought it back in. It's not a tax if it's not ending up in the government coffers. And actually, in order for it to get Republican support, two, I think, really smart things happened. One, like Canada, they borrowed the money for the first check so that the check goes out first. And they're like, I love this government program. I have no idea what it's for, but I love getting whatever it was. I got a 40-something, $70 check. And then when the gas prices go up, you're like, that's funny. But just, you know what I mean? It buys some credibility. The other thing that is important is that it goes in a separate escrow account in the government so that it doesn't go into the IRS can't use it to plug a hole in Social Security or to pay for LIHEAP or whatever really important things. That money has to be paid down at the end of every month. $0.00 are left in there. So all that money goes back.
So I pay tax on the gas and then I pay the fee.
Well, no, because the
Yeah, we're
tax.
right.
We can just move on.
Yeah. Technically, they would say it's a fee at the beginning and a tax at the end, but whatever.
Okay.
Sorry.
Do we just,
Well, the tax on the gas is for roadways. You're not paying a carbon tax on gas.
right. Like the regular, I would pay gas just like I do now with taxes involved.
Yeah.
And then the fee would be added on, go into escrow, come back as taxable.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
This is enough to pull 2.6 million Americans above the poverty line with dividend checks. It also, it's amazing how many people live in the poverty line in this country, in the wealthiest country in the world. There's also the fact that, what was the other thing I was going to say about this? Oh, there was a study done. If you were to exempt gasoline, because in one of our meetings with Angus King, I think I can share this. Usually I have to be pretty calm. Just don't tell him this. He was like, you can't ask me to put a carbon price in place when inflation in summer 22 was like crazy. So I said, well then just exempt vehicle from. You can do whatever you want. And you would think that would have a tremendous impact to how effective it was on climate. Resources for the Future, this is like really brainy think tank, said it's less than 2% effect on the impact. Because most of the major, at that point, major car manufacturers had said they're kind of getting rid of the internal combustion engine. Even if we don't apply it on the gas for your vehicle, you're not going to have a component, a vehicular, the gas isn't going to be part of this situation in 8 to 10 years when most people have. Sorry, getting wonky again. Go ahead. Oh, this is the most encouraging. So this is a map of the world of all the countries that have some form of carbon tax. You can see the distinction we've got there, shared that with, we're the only developed nation in gray on this map. Belarus, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Russia, right? Obviously, some people balk and say, like, how come Russia is not considered? The World Bank does not consider Russia a developed nation because it doesn't. It basically has like one export, right? It's got like fossil fuel exports. It doesn't have a diversified enough economy. It's less than the economy of Italy, right? And it's and you have to have more diversification of your products than just having. But next slide, please. The reason, compare this map with the next one. Sorry for the blurriness. This is the most encouraging. The reason why a lot of business folks are pushing in this direction is because we have an unmonetized advantage. We could be business folks could be making money on this. If the average good or service within the United States had one, mysterious unit of carbon price, the average carbon unit, you can see we're slightly more carbon efficient than Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. We're 3 times more carbon efficient from the average good and service than China, nearly 4 times more carbon efficient than India, and over 4 times more carbon efficient than Russia. So if we start putting this carbon tariff in place, the carbon price, that will bring a lot of manufacturing back to this country because it's no longer makes sense for us to make widgets in China and we're just relying on coal and then use the diesel to ship it across to the United States. The only place that's better than us marginally is Europe because they've been on a carbon pricing scheme for decades. Keep going. Okay, this is the big ask. Because Maine is so influential, we've been pitching this to business leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and municipal leaders. We have gotten municipal resolutions supporting, basically going to a town saying, like, look, your public works things are exploding because of these climate incidents, climate-related storms. How about just sending your voice to Washington with us saying, like, a written thing saying, like, please help us pass this policy. It doesn't mean you can't pass other things. Of course, the usual progressive towns that pass it, like, Cape Elizabeth, Suffolk, in my hometown, the People's Republic of Portland, have passed this unanimously. But towns that went significantly for the Republican candidate in the last presidential election, like Hamden and Wilton and Starks and Vida, and those towns have also supported this policy. I would love to add Bath to this map. If there was a city council.
I like the new name. It's not carbon price, it's carbon cashback.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes I even switch it further and say cashback carbon pricing. Because cashback, you got my attention, right? But that's exactly, we've found that if you're interested, there's carbon cashback for number 4 Maine, ME. Carbon cashback for me is a place to learn about this. It has includes in there whether your town is a small town that has a once a year meeting, like we got passed in Vinehaven and Starks and places, or we get passed by a town select board, like Casco just happened in November, or if it was a referendum like Kennebunk and Camden did, Kennebunk last year, Camden in November again, or city council vote, which was Portland, was like, those guys passed it off. Anyways, yeah, go ahead.
You have some population there. Do you know what the numbers are?
A friend of mine just told me that this represents 25% of the population of Maine. Okay, next slide. So, anyways, again, we talked almost exclusively about carbon pricing. These other things are important too. Next slide after that. If you were asking about how do I make this just a U.S. model, this is not a model that I paid for because this one costs, so I don't use it. But the Princeton Repeat Lab has
in fits and starts, the US greenhouse gas emissions, so just the US now, we're working our way down, right? In, more or less. Next, click again. Then with the Inflation Reduction Act, we got at least a 28% reductions. That dashed line is what we said we would get to by Paris, okay? So that's the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, but without the permitting reform. So in the short term, the permitting reform gets us to, click, there, 40%, still missing our goal, just because we need to kind of move on getting more, getting these, speed up the process in order to get more solar, wind, hydro, whatever it might be, projects on board. But if we add a carbon pricing, click again, then we've exceeded our goal. And that's just in the short term. It really pays off in the long and the decades after as the price continues up. Click again for me. But why stop there? We can add healthy forests to sequester some of that carbon in the atmosphere. And then lastly, additional, one more click, building energy efficiency and electrification is 60%. So we could become a real world leader if we got there. If only. Click again. Thank you. So this is what we do. We've got 8 chapters of Citizens Climate Lobby in the state. We've got in June our last in-person meetings. Lobbying Congress is the first and foremost thing we do. We do a Zoom meeting every December. We do in-person meetings where we bring over 1,000 people down to DC. And we meet with every lawmaker from Bernie Sanders to Ted Cruz and everybody in between. All 100% of offices and 95% of the House offices last night. We also work on media relationship, just getting the word out through traditional print media, radio, television if we can, but also social media. Grassroots outreach, which is giving talks like this. Grass Talks engagement, which is getting those endorsements from municipal endorsements or business leaders or faith leaders. And then chapter development, just kind of know what we work on. It's a great group of people, even if it's just you join and you get, you click on sending a message to Congress. That takes 20 seconds a month. That's more than most people do. So, go ahead.
There's a comment that unfortunately the Brunswick chapter meets at this time on Wednesday.
Yes, they're meeting right now.
Yes. So I found myself struggling with that I joined that group and then found it. So just for future knowledge.
Maybe they should move. We can talk about moving. I'm technically the boss.
Well, I think at this point I'm willing to Bath in Bath. We've reached out to them. I mean, it's not the Brunswick; it's the Mid Coast.
Right, south. I think it's Mid Coast
South. I don't know, the Mid Coast, one of the Mid Coast groups, and I think everybody that was there was from Brunswick. I'm not sure.
Okay. I can catch it. Yeah. Next, please. All right. So. Action is the antidote to despair. It's really scary what's going on out there on climate. But you can scan that code or just take this picture if you'd like. And what you want to do is ask Congress to support carbon fee and dividend. It's an easy thing to do. It takes either call or ask you to do cclusa.org/right-CFD or write that down. Talk to your friends about climate solutions, join Citizens Climate Education, Climate Lobby at cecilia.org. Tons of material online, with most of this I'm sharing with you from that. You can write about climate policy into your journal, local newspaper, or social media. Gather endorsements from community leaders, that really helps. And of course, the piece de resistance is coming down or doing a Zoom meeting in December or coming down to our in-person big lobby meetings every June or July this year, I guess. And if you're a right of center, we have our own conservatives only meetings that happen in March, which I think is really brilliant. If you're conservative political persuasion, but you're concerned about climate, come down and talk to the conservative lawmakers. Next slide, please. I'm wrapping it up. I started. This is a picture of what we do. So that's on the top left is a picture of me with Susan Collins and a bunch of the team that we had there. Peter Garrett, some familiar faces there for Paul and others. Adolfo Cana, the African gentleman on the left, is from Sacred Heart. He's a climatologist from the University of Bujumbura. And he's now a new Mainer. He lives in Lewiston. That's my daughter on the left. She actually wasn't that bored in the meeting. She did a great job. And just the camera went off when she looked particularly bored. Her job in that meeting as a Catholic family meeting with a sitting Catholic senator from Maine, her job was to provide the statements from the past 4 popes on environmental and climate stewardship and the endorsement from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for carbon fee and dividends. Hello. And the Pope's statements about carbon pricing. I'm not above invoking my Catholic faith to give a guilt trip to a sitting Catholic senator, but we don't know. It remains to be seen if that will work.
So where does that sitting Catholic senator sit?
Where she is, okay, so we have one Republican. My region, when I was the regional director, was the 6 New England states. We only have one Republican in 6 states. That's Sue Collins. She, in 2010, when everybody was going in the direction of a European-style cap and trade, she was worried about, like, if we just make it a stock market for your ability to pollute, that's going to hurt low-income people. And I'm sympathetic to that. So she, instead of a cap and trade, wanted a cap and dividend proceeds from that money. That's called the 2009 or 2010 Clear Act, with Senator Caldwell from Oregon. They teamed up together, a Republican and a Democrat, and wrote this bill. She's been grumpy about that not getting the support that she felt like it deserved at the time, and I feel like she's got a right to that, because everybody was like, it's, it's too late, Susan, we're just doing this cap and trade thing. And then everybody moved to Obamacare and the political capital was lost. So that's a long story. Hope springs eternal that one would think, she at least meets with us, right? And she considers, she wants to see more proof all the time of like how this is going to benefit Mainers. So anyways, during Zoom, actually this guy here in the middle is Angus King is not Catholic, he's Episcopal. So we brought the Episcopal bishop with us, along with Adam Lee, who sells cars in Maine. You may have heard of that guy. A few of others. I don't know if Episcopal guilt works the same way Catholic guilt does, but we brought him. And that's my daughter, Fanny Shelley Pingree. We threw Shelley Pingree a party when she became Maine's first lawmaker to endorse one of 97's to endorse carbon. Next slide. Okay, that's it. All right, so that's a picture of us. I don't know, probably 1,100 of us. I don't think that's I think it's 2 years ago. I don't remember that. Can you see yourself, Peter? Anyways, Dr. James Hansen, who was the original person to bring climate to a joint session of Congress and testify in 1987, got the attention of a young senator from Tennessee named Al Gore, has been really on board. He said, we're trying to do, there's a lot of local stuff, there's a lot of state level stuff. We're trying to move, as hard as it might seem, to move the very highest reaches of national and international policy direction. So he says, most impressive is the word. He says, it's time all if you want to join the fight to save the planet, to save creation for your grandchildren. There is no more effective step you can take than becoming an active member of this group. So I hope you join. And then the next slide is just my information. So feel free to call me or write an email or something. Go ahead, Curtis.
So what would be the reason that we start a chapter of our own rather than joining Brunswick? Just doing parallel work, like introducing a resolution here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think they are really great people committed in Brunswick. It's not that far. And a lot of them are like I rely on because they are retired economics professors and environmental studies professors who really know how this works. It's always less work, kind of like team up with one and be like, what can we do? And you can also just be a subgroup where you guys meet for coffee once a month, watch the recording of their meetings, or like have their chapter leader come up or I would be happy to come up and talk about like, okay, who wants to talk to this, the UU church in town and see if they would endorse it, and all those endorsements or who wants to talk to this city councilor or whatever this business, or who knows the PI talking. We know that the military is moving fast on climate because they are realizing they lose a lot of money and a lot of lives trying to protect fossil fuel resources as they, those supply lines are expensive in both capital and lives.
You mean VIW and production?
their production line, they're moving away.
Oh, well, I know, not VIW specifically, but often, well, I mean, I would argue, the lines, military industrial complex,
Right.
they're worried about climate. How many percentage of their bases are at risk of going under by 2050? It's like 8%. Because they're all coastal.
There is a mid-coast citizens.
Yes, that's the
It's
Bath.
not Brunswick. When I said Brunswick, I should have
It
said.
used to be called Bath Brunswick. I don't know why they changed it.
Well, probably because they're probably trying to reach other people, but I
Yeah.
would say we should join that one and then split off if we get enough involvement, trying to start a whole new thing. And they're very active and they're very responsive. As soon as I came and the leader of that group asked if we just to find out what I was interested in. So.
Is that Lori Vance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, if you like start there and then if we get a large enough back, you can do it.
Yeah, he was the chapter leader before Lori. And before that was Jody. Sam has a son who's had some needs, has some health issues, so he had to step back, but he still comes to the meetings. Thank you. I'm sorry, was that too much information? Does anyone feel more hopeful to show hands? Okay, all right. More hopeful? Okay,
Nice to know.
good. Yes, that's what I was hoping. All right. So anytime you want me to talk to somebody from the city council, I'm happy to come on. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm there.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. I'm relying on a lift.
Yeah, Mr. Monroe, can you stop for a